June 3, 1942. The Aleutian Islands, Alaska. The Japanese carrier aircraft that appeared over Dutch Harbor on the morning of June 3, 1942 were the first enemy aircraft to attack American soil since the War of 1812, if the Hawaiian Islands are considered separately from the continental territory, and the appearance of those aircraft over an American naval station in the fog-shrouded islands of the Aleutian chain produced a reaction in the American command structure that the Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor was not, in its primary strategic purpose, designed to produce. The attack on Dutch Harbor was a diversion. The Japanese combined fleet had planned it as a sideshow to the main event, the Battle of Midway, which was supposed to draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement, while the Aleutian operation captured two of the westernmost islands in the chain, Attu and Kiska, and established Japanese military presence on American soil as both a strategic outpost and a propaganda victory. Midway did not go according to plan. The four Japanese carriers that were supposed to demonstrate Japanese naval supremacy and destroy the American carrier force were themselves destroyed by American dive bombers on June 4 and 5, 1942, in the engagement that changed the course of the Pacific War. But the Aleutian diversion, which had always been secondary in the Japanese strategic calculation, went according to its own plan. Japanese forces landed on Attu and Kiska in early June 1942, established garrisons, and settled in to occupy what was, by any geographic reckoning, American territory. American territory. Attu was approximately 1,700 miles from the Alaskan mainland and approximately 750 miles from the nearest significant Japanese base. Kiska was slightly closer to Japan. Both islands were among the most inhospitable pieces of land on Earth, their terrain a combination of volcanic mountains, treacherous muskegs, and the specific meteorological conditions of the Aleutian chain that produced fog and rain and wind and sudden violent storms in combinations that made military operations of any kind extraordinarily difficult. The Japanese soldiers who occupied Attu and Kiska in the summer of 1942 discovered this quickly. The occupation that had been planned as a strategic outpost became a logistical ordeal as the Aleutian weather made resupply by sea increasingly hazardous, and the American submarine campaign and air attacks from the Alaskan bases made it more so. The American response to the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska was immediate in its political dimension, because the occupation of American territory was a political fact that required a political response, and extended in its military dimension, because assembling the force and the logistics for an offensive operation in the most inaccessible and most climatically hostile part of the North Pacific required time that the political urgency demanded but that the military reality could not eliminate. The campaign to retake the Aleutians began with the establishment of American air and naval superiority over the islands through the combined efforts of the Army Air Force's 11th Air Force and the naval forces assigned to the North Pacific, a campaign that isolated the Japanese garrisons progressively as 1942 became 1943. The assault on Attu began on May 11, 1943, when American forces landed on the island in conditions that the planning had not adequately accounted for. The conditions of the Aleutian campaign were unlike anything that American military planning had specifically prepared for in its training, its equipment, or its doctrine. The weather was not merely bad in the conventional military sense of degrading air and naval support. It was actively hostile in ways that the specific environment of the Aleutians produced. The tundra that covered Attu's interior was a deceptive surface that appeared to provide solid footing and concealed beneath it a layer of mud and water that consumed men's feet, soaking boots that the available material had not been designed for this specific kind of wet, and producing a condition called immersion foot, a progressive destruction of the foot's tissue by sustained cold and wet that incapacitated men who had not suffered a single wound from enemy action. The fog that was the Aleutian's most characteristic weather condition eliminated the close air support that American amphibious operations had learned to rely on, made naval gunfire support difficult to direct accurately, and reduced the visibility that infantry commanders used to assess terrain and enemy positions to the few meters that American forces could see in the fog that the islands produced with their characteristic indifference to military planning. The Japanese garrison on Attu, approximately 2,650 soldiers under Colonel Yasuyo Yamazaki, had been on the island long enough to understand its terrain and its weather in ways that the American attacking force did not. They had built defensive positions in the high ground that the fog concealed from aerial and naval observation, positions that the attacking force encountered when they moved inland from the beaches, and from which the Japanese defenders could engage attackers who could not see them until they were within the defenders' effective range. The terrain of Attu's interior was itself the most formidable obstacle that the attacking force encountered. The mountains of Attu rose from a shoreline in gradients that made movement difficult in good conditions and treacherous in the cold and wet and fog that the island's weather produced continuously. Men who were already weakened by immersion foot and by the cold that the Aleutian summer produced in men equipped for warmer climates struggled across terrain that their training had not specifically prepared them for. The American force on Attu, approximately 11,000 soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, had been trained in the California desert for an operation in North Africa that had not materialized when the strategic situation changed. They arrived in the Aleutians with desert training and desert equipment, and found that the specific lessons of desert warfare translated imperfectly to the specific demands of the Aleutian tundra. They fought anyway, not with the ease that adequate preparation would have produced, but with the stubborn persistence that Americans produce when the conditions exceed the preparation and the mission has to be accomplished regardless. The fighting on Attu lasted 19 days, from May 11th to May 30th, 1943, and produced casualties that in proportion to the size of the forces involved exceeded the proportional casualty rates of most Pacific Island battles. American casualties were 549 killed and 1,148 wounded in combat, with an additional 2,100 battle casualties from cold injuries, disease, and the specific accidents that fighting in the Aleutian conditions produced. Total casualties, including non-battle, were approximately 3,800 of the 11,000 men who fought on Attu, a casualty rate of approximately 35%. The fighting produced Medal of Honor actions that reflected the specific character of the Attu battle, individual soldiers making the tactical decisions that the fog and the terrain and the disorienting conditions of Aleutian combat required when the larger unit coordination that conventional tactics specified was simply not possible. The final Japanese counterattack on May 29, 1943 was the most extraordinary event of the Attu campaign and one of the most significant banzai charges of the Pacific War. Colonel Yamazaki, recognizing that his position was hopeless and that organized resistance could not be sustained, assembled the survivors of his garrison for a final attack that was planned not merely as a last-ditch defensive response but as the specific form of military death that Japanese military culture specified for exactly this situation, an all-out assault intended to take as many Americans as possible before the garrison was destroyed. Approximately 800 surviving Japanese soldiers participated in the May 29th attack, which broke through the American lines and reached the artillery positions near Massacre Bay before being contained and destroyed in fighting that was described by the soldiers who experienced it as some of the most intense of the Aleutian campaign. Medical personnel at the aid station near the Japanese penetration fought with weapons as the assault reached their position. Engineers and service troops who were behind the artillery positions found themselves in combat for which they had not been the designated force. When the counterattack was over, approximately 500 Japanese soldiers were dead in the positions they had broken through to. A small number had escaped to the mountains, where they were eventually found and killed or captured over the following days. Of Colonel Yamazaki's garrison of 2,650 men, 28 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. The operation that followed Attu was one of the most extraordinary anticlimaxes in the history of military operations. The American and Canadian force of approximately 34,000 soldiers assembled to retake Kiska, where Japanese intelligence estimated that a garrison of approximately 10,000 men had been reinforcing since the Attu defeat, landed on Kiska on August 15, 1943. There were no Japanese soldiers on Kiska. The Japanese Navy had executed a brilliantly planned and executed evacuation operation on July 28 to 29, using a combination of covering fog and high-speed destroyer runs to remove the entire Kiska garrison of approximately 5,200 men without the knowledge of the American forces blockading the island. The evacuation was not detected until after it was complete, because the fog that had been the Aleutians' most persistent feature protected the evacuation as it had protected the defenders throughout the campaign. The 34,000 Americans and Canadians who landed on Kiska on August 15 found an empty island. They did not find it without casualties. The fog and the unfamiliar terrain produced friendly fire incidents and accidents during the landing that killed 28 Americans and wounded 50 more. Additional casualties resulted from booby traps that the Japanese had left before departing. But there were no Japanese soldiers to fight. The garrison that had been there had left, silently, in the fog, approximately 3 weeks before the landing. The Kiska battle has been treated by military historians with the combination of appreciation for the Japanese operational achievement and recognition of the lesson it taught about the limits of intelligence in the specific conditions that the Aleutian fog created, conditions that could conceal a military operation of extraordinary scale from the surveillance that American forces had been maintaining around the island. The Aleutian campaign concluded with the American recapture of American territory, the elimination of the Attu garrison after 19 days of fighting, and the discovery that the Kiska garrison had simply disappeared into the fog from which the campaign itself had always seemed to emerge and into which it eventually resolved. It was not a campaign that the American public followed with the attention it gave to Guadalcanal and North Africa, because its geography was remote and its weather made it difficult to photograph, and because its strategic significance, while real, was not the kind that produced the dramatic narrative that the other campaigns of 1942 and 1943 provided. It was a campaign where Americans fought for American soil, in conditions that their training had not prepared them for, against a defender who used the terrain and the weather more effectively than the attacker, and won. The soldiers who took Attu did so at a cost that the proportional casualty figures capture accurately. They went up mountains in fog against defenders they could not see, with feet that were beginning to destroy themselves from the inside, in weather that the training for North Africa had not prepared them for. They took the island. That was the Aleutian Campaign. That was what Americans did to take back American soil from the only foreign force to occupy it since 1812. They went up the mountains in the fog.